here right now representing Phasecraft, so you tell you a little bit about the company. And what I'd like to do is say a few things about how we are, about who we are, and then go on to say a bit about some of our recent scientific results. As this is a scientific conference, I'd say a little bit about that, and obviously answer any questions that you might have. So just to get started with a few words about the company. So Phasecraft is a quantum software company, and what I would say is that this word software is one that we interpret very broadly as including everything from the underpinning sort of mathematics and theoretical physics of quantum computing, quantum information, right the way through to designing and optimizing quantum algorithms, and then ultimately coding them up and running them on real or emulated quantum hardware. So what you can see here is a picture of the team as of last summer, including some interns that were working with us then. Some of them you may recognise from around the room. And this is on the roof terrace of our office in London, which is pretty nice. So that was fun. That was a sort of party we had then. And yeah, so Phasecraft is a quantum software company, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the most out of the quantum computers that we have now, or that we might have in the next 2 to 5 year sort of period, as opposed to perhaps the ones that we're going to have in the next 10 to 20 years time, when we're sort of fully in this sort of fault tolerant era. And we think these are really exciting and important too. There are lots of exciting applications there, but we want to address the sort of nearer term applications first, because we think that this is perhaps the most immediate challenge between us and making quantum computing a exciting practical reality. And the sort of applications that we have in mind, particularly ones that we think are particularly promising for this sort of fairly near-term era, are ones to do with simulation of quantum systems. So modeling systems that come from quantum mechanics and which are really challenging to simulate for our best classical methods. So this is something I guess that many people think is a plausible application of quantum computers. Certainly came up a lot in the panel discussion just now, and we're no exception. So we think that there's some potentially really important use cases in areas like designing new batteries, new solar cells, things like that, where quantum computers could play an important role. And really the goal of the company is to push down the hardware requirements of the quantum algorithms that we have, so that we can make these applications real with the very limited quantum hardware that we're going to have in coming years. So the company is a few years old now. Its first round of venture funding was in 2019, second round in 2020. It was founded by Toby Cubitt, John Morton and me, and it's based in Bristol and London. We have a team of around 15 across both places. Our office here in Bristol is just sort of down the hill, but if you go down Park Street to the bottom, you get to this sort of grassy area called College Green, and that's where the cathedral is and various other sort of government buildings and things. And just behind that, there's our offices, which are in Bristol University's Quantum Technologies Innovation Centre, which is like an incubator for quantum tech startups. And that's where we're based, here in Bristol. And yeah, so what I'd like to switch to now is just to say a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing, and in particular, some of the scientific results we'll be coming up with. And a real area of focus for us over the last couple of years has been this model called the Fermi-Hubbard model, which maybe many of you are familiar with. So this is a really famous, or maybe I should say notorious, model for understanding strongly correlated electronic systems. And we think it's a particularly interesting model for a few reasons. One is that it's just extremely hard to solve classically. So as far as I know, the most recent exact solution of most recent and largest exact solution of a Fermi-Hubbard instance, the largest one used 17 fermions on 22 sites, 17 electrons on 22 sites. And this used like 7 terabytes of memory. And if you want to do something that is perhaps on 50 sites, then this is completely intractable classically. And the reason is that basically each site, each position that an electron can be in corresponds to 2 qubits. So basically you're looking at simulating a 100 qubit quantum system, which is very hard to do exactly. So that's the first reason, I guess, why this is interesting, because it's a very challenging and very sort of famous benchmark from classical physics, well, from classical methods for quantum physics, but also it's a a sort of fundamental and quite relatively basic, but it's a fundamental model for understanding this behavior of strongly correlated electrons, which sort of is a stepping stone to understanding more realistic materials that might occur in practice. So it sort of seems like an interesting starting point to try to understand what we can do with quantum simulation in this sort of NISQ era. So, the way this model works is that we've got a system of sites here, which you can see this laser pointer. We've got a system of sites, and each site can have an up electron or a down electron or both in it. And electrons can hop between different sites. And then when they're on the same site, they can interact. If you have an up electron and a down electron in the same place, they can interact. And so there's a number of different questions you can ask about this system, but one, I guess, that's particularly interesting is to try to understand what the low energy physics of this system looks like perhaps what's the ground state of this system look like, or what's the ground state energy of this system of a certain size. And that's, I guess, one of the first things I'd like to tell you about, which is a recent project of ours, which was looking at implementing a simulation of this model on quantum hardware. Okay, so, right, so a few people have looked at solving the Fermi-Hubbard model on a quantum computer, looked at the problem of finding the ground state of this model. So there's a few sort of nice experiments that have been done. For example, back in 2018, there was an experiment in ion traps which solved a instance of the Fermi-Hubbard model with 2 sites. So this is this you would think should be 4 qubits because you have 2 qubits per site, but in fact they used a compression technique to kind of compress this down to 2 qubits. Then in 2020, we did some work where we looked at solving again a 2x1 Fermi-Hubbard instance using 2 qubits. That was on some superconducting qubit hardware from Rigetti. And more recently, there's a nice paper from IBM, which solved a 4-site Fermi-Hubbard model, again using compression down to 3 qubits. And they were able to get some sort of nice results producing the ground state of that. And what we were looking at was using some quantum hardware from Google. We had a very nice collaboration, in fact, with Tom, who's here, and some other members of the Google team. And we were using a Google quantum processor to, again, try to produce ground states of the Fermi-Hubbard model using variational algorithms, using the VQE method. And we were looking at instances that were quite a bit larger. So we were looking at 1x8 and 2x4 instances in particular. So this corresponds to things on 16, corresponds to quantum circuits on 16 qubits. This is substantially bigger. And in particular, I guess the reason why this is interesting is that, like, the algorithm that we were using, we didn't use these sorts of notions of compression that have been done before. So this is something which is more easily scalable up to larger sizes. So you have a sort of very clear and very efficient quantum circuit that you can sort of scale up to bigger sizes. And hopefully when quantum hardware improves, this will get you to a point beyond what you can easily simulate classically. Like 16 qubits is still clearly within the realm of classical simulation, but perhaps this puts us on a pathway to get beyond that. And I just want to say a little bit about how this algorithm worked. So we were using a 23-qubit quantum processor from Google, and we were laying out the sites of our lattice that we were wanting to solve. It's Fermi-Hubbard lattice in this sort of zigzag way. So, for example, if we were looking at a 1x8 system, then we'd have one sort of line up here, a sort of zigzagging line of all of the qubits that with corresponding to spin up electrons up there. So you imagine that each of these qubits is 1. If there's a spin up electron at that site, it's 0 if not. And then we have like spin down ones below. And then we have a quantum circuit which is supposed to be producing the ground state of the Fermi-Hubbard model, represented in this way. And we try to find this ground state using the VQE approach. So we optimize over a whole family of quantum circuits, which is intended to produce this. And in the end, we hope that we produce something that is indeed a good approximation of the ground state. And what we found is that without the use of error mitigation techniques, you don't get very good results. So what we can see here below is the error that we get between the best possible error within the family of variational circuits we were using and the experimental result from the device. And the lines here are showing different error mitigation techniques. And I'm not going to go through all of them here, but one thing I'll just mention is like this big blue one, like this is just using sort of the most simple error mitigation technique that you can think of really, which is basically just throwing away answers which don't have the right number of electrons, which is something you can check easily. And if you do this, which is still better than doing nothing, then you have sort of very inaccurate results sometimes. But you can build in more and more error mitigation techniques. And then in the end, you end up with something which, like there's the bottom one, the purple line, which uses all sorts of symmetries of the problem and also an error mitigation technique called training with fermionic linear optics, which we came up with, which I'm happy to discuss more about if anyone's interested. And putting all of these together, we get something which is actually fairly accurate. So what this x-axis is showing here is the number of electrons in the system. And this also affects the complexity of the quantum circuits that you're using, which is why you have sort of different error behavior for each point. But what we see is that you need to put together lots of these different error mitigation techniques to get a good result. And we also used a new variational optimization algorithm, which was developed by Jan Lucas, who is here. And this was very nice because it enabled us to use fewer iterations to solve, to get closer to the ground state than certain previous algorithms. So this algorithm was somehow targeted at this sort of noisy device. So, sort of putting these things together meant that we could get a pretty high accuracy result. And I guess the interesting question then is like, when you run this quantum algorithm, can you actually get physically meaningful results out, physically meaningful data out? And the sort of natural thing that you might want to do with this VQE method, firstly, is to compute energy. So you're trying to produce the ground state of a system and you want to compute the energy of that. That's sort of the thing you're optimizing. So it's the first thing you might try to do. And what we saw is that the experimental results, when you build in all of these error mitigation techniques, they're pretty good in that the blue line here, which is the real experiment, so it matches pretty closely the simulated experiments. This is like a simulated perfect quantum computer. It's still a little bit away from the true ground state energy. So the simulated one is the best that you could possibly do with the family of quantum circuits that we were looking at. So, if you want to actually precisely produce the ground state, you're going to need a higher depth quantum circuit. But within the family of quantum circuits we were looking at, the blue line and the orange line sort of match up pretty precisely. So that was kind of good news. But really, an energy is just a number, and maybe what's more interesting is to get some kind of qualitative physical information out of the experiments. And the results we had were accurate enough that we were able to see that we did get some sort of some nice physical information out about what was really going on in the system. Because what we were able to observe is this multi-insulating behavior, so-called, which basically says that when this lattice is sort of half filled with electrons, if you want to put another electron in, it costs you some energy because there's this sort of term in the Hamiltonian that penalizes that. So if you add in another electron, then you see this sort of jump in this so-called chemical potential, which is the derivative basically of the energy. So along here, the x-axis is the number of electrons, and you can see that the derivative of the energy kind of goes up relatively smoothly. Then there's a kind of jump in the middle, and this is the second derivative here, so you can sort of see this maybe more clearly. So this is sort of one of the bits of physical information you might want to know about the system, and we were able to extract that too from these experiments, which was quite nice. So the only other result I wanted to mention we worked on recently, which is one that I was not involved with myself, is closely connected to Laura's talk earlier today, and so I'm going to mention it briefly. So this was work on time dynamics of the Fermi-Hubbard model. So as well as these kind of variational methods for producing ground states, you might also be interested in simulating the time evolution of a quantum system, and in particular this Fermi-Hubbard model. And we had worked on a new way of doing time dynamic simulation more efficiently by the so-called sub-circuit model that we've been working with. And basically the idea is that and again, Laura mentioned much more about this morning, is that if you have a quantum algorithm, maybe based on trotterization, which contains a lot of small rotation gates in it, a lot of unitaries which are quite close to the identity, it's probably not a good idea to decompose these in terms of big unitary operations like CNOTs or something like that. It's better to decompose them into sort of small elementary operations themselves, because if it takes more time or introduces more errors to do a big rotation, then that's bad news for the sort of amount of errors you're going to see as your circuit proceeds. If instead your small rotations are less costly or introduce less errors than the big rotations, then this can save you a lot of errors and effectively lets you produce a longer quantum circuit in the same amount of time. And when we use this idea combined with our fermionic encoding for Fermi-Hubbard model, which is more compact than any other encoding, then this lets us reduce the complexity of simulating time dynamics of the Fermi-Hubbard model of a particular instance size. There's all of the small print down here, which I'm going to go through. It lets us reduce the complexity of the sort of textbook version of time dynamics simulation from about 1 million effective runtime of about 1 million to an effective runtime of about 260 steps. So this is like a very substantial reduction by going to this different model, which in which we sort of account for the cost of these gates differently. These sort of small rotations are costed as less expensive than the big ones. Okay, and if you'd like to learn more, these papers at the bottom there, hopefully you can just about see, they're recently published and also on the archive. Okay, so this is pretty much everything I wanted to say. So I just wanted to say finally that we're hiring. So if anyone's interested in the sorts of things that I discussed and would like to speak to me about coming to work with us, that would be fantastic. So we're looking for full-time research staff. Also, we work with a number of PhD students, supporting them throughout their PhD, and that's something we're definitely interested in doing again in future. We are setting up a visiting fellowship scheme for people who might have an academic position but are interested in coming to work with us for some period of time. And we also have an internship scheme. So applications are closed for this year, this summer, but if anyone's interested in applying for next year, they'd be very welcome to, or indeed, it doesn't have to be over the summer months. If someone is interested in coming to work with us as an intern, maybe in autumn or winter, that's definitely possible too. So if you're interested, you can just email that address or just talk to me or one of the team. And yeah, speaking of the team, here is a picture of the people on, well, in fact, not all of the people from Phasecraft who are here, most of the people from Phasecraft who are here. So if you're interested in learning more about the company, please talk to any of them and they will be very friendly and tell you more about the company. So thanks very much.
Are there any questions?
What inspired you to make your own beer?
Yeah. Well, why wouldn't you, right? I mean,
You're right, silly question.
no, I think this is the beer which I hope many of you have enjoyed at this event is actually the second in the line of Phasecraft beers. Actually, we previously had another one, Hopping Term, another event. And basically, I think, yeah, other than the sort of initial Phasecraft beer pun, there's basically an infinite opportunity for further quantum beer-based puns. So we're very much interested in hearing any ideas that anyone might have about those.
Any other questions?
Sorry? Sid?
Were there any other questions? If not, let's thank Ashley again.